For what is the life of a man if it is not interwoven with the life of former generations by a sense of history? Marcus Tullius Cicero. If anybody had a marrow-deep sense of history, it was James Montgomery. Mr. Mont's place in so many of our lives began in a classroom, with him showing us our place in a much larger story. Like ancient shamans, classical orators, and medieval bards, Mr. Mont would recount the rousing stories of our forebears with verve and simplicity. Theologian Martin Luther compared human reason and its tendency to embrace opposite errors rather than the truth to a drunkard on horseback, falling off to one side only to unsteadily hoist himself back up and fall off the other. Mr. Mont avoided the opposite errors of 1, teaching history through rose-colored glasses, and 2, engaging in chronological snobbery. The former romanticizes the past. The latter demonizes it. Mr. Mont humanized it. His teaching of history, warts and all, was suffused with deep humility and profound gratitude, much like the man himself. I first learned of Mr. Mont's middle name, Horace, back when I, along with my classmates, were attending one of his many cookouts. I'm unsure why Dr. Montgomery and Margaret chose that middle name for their youngest boy, but the most historic bearer of it was the Roman poet made famous for his lyrical odes. In that same spirit, the following ode of sorts recounts how, throughout his long life, Mr. Mont embodied, albeit in a distinctly American way, 3 civic virtues prized by the ancient Romans: dignity, piety, and virtue. Dignity for the Romans, according to classical historian Adrian Goldsworthy, was the sober bearing that displayed openly the importance and responsibility of a man, and so commanded respect. While Roman dignity was chiefly reserved for members of the high-born patrician class, the dignity James demonstrated drank deeply from the teaching of the Christian scriptures. This dignity derived its legitimacy and substantial source not from high birth, personal wealth, or professional achievement, but from the imago Dei, the very image of God imprinted upon all men and women. It was a more sublime dignity, purged of haughty airs and self-righteous hierarchies. It was an image James sought to live out among his fellow image bearers. If James Montgomery was in a movie, his musical theme would be Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. Or if you commissioned an artist to paint his portrait, it would have to be Norman Rockwell. In so many ways, James manifested the Jeffersonian ideal, an individual untethered by tyranny and alive with hope in the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, what Abraham Lincoln termed the apple of gold, given practical political expression in and protection by the Constitution, what Lincoln termed that silver picture framing and preserving the prized Declaration. Roman piety went beyond solemn respect for the gods and included an abiding regard for parents and family, the law and tradition. In his magisterial 2-volume book, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, a 19th century French diplomat, cited America's civil society, the vast network of voluntary and often local associations, as the chief source of the young republic's vitality and dynamism, and a prerequisite for the preservation of its citizens' cherished liberties. For many Americans then, and for many Americans now, their conduit into civil society was the church, not a materially flush, politically favored, and doctrinally compromised branch of a spiritually moribund state church, but a local congregation of believers and their children, called out from the world by the gospel, confessing a common creed. Many secular commentators, lamenting the decline of civil society across America, have empirically observed the central role churches across the theological spectrum have played in the lives of so many citizens as hubs of community cohesion, sources of spiritual uplift, and ballasts against economic hardship throughout this nation's history. James knew intimately the importance of personal communion with his fellow redeemed sinners throughout our often rocky pilgrimage through this vale of tears to the celestial city. The son and brother of prominent Presbyterian ministers and a seminary graduate himself, James was an exemplary churchman. He served as elder, taught Sunday school, sang in the choir, and when he wasn't using his gifts tending souls, he helped tend the church grounds. To paraphrase Paul, James planted, James watered, but it was God who gave the increase. Virtue, while having a more martial sense in Roman times, included the traits of moral courage and self-sacrifice. Beyond his sacred vocation of serving the church, in his secular vocation of teaching about our nation's past, James was keen on contributing to our community's future. His contributions as a county commissioner, scoutmaster, and philanthropist are legion, and their collective impact will be felt for generations to come. On a personal note, James was a father in the faith and a dear friend. Mr. Mont was a product of Lake City, Florida, and now Lake City, Florida, in many ways, is a product of Mr. Mont. May God in His providence grant us the grace to learn from James's example and build upon his rich legacy of dignity, piety, and virtue. James's long and renowned chapter has come to a close. Now it's up to us to write the rest of the story.